everyone, my name is Niels Haan. I am from the University of Vienna, and this is a presentation about a paper called Collective Culpable Ignorance. All right, so we often hold groups responsible for various sorts of things, and sometimes these are organized groups like corporations or states, but sometimes, and at least this is what I think, sometimes we can also make claims about groups that are not agents, and yet we have the group really as the locus of responsibility. So the idea is that even if a group is not a group agent, the group can be morally responsible as such in a non-distributive way. So what the group is responsible for is not the same as what each individual is responsible for. And so this group level of responsibility does not entail the member level of responsibility, but it also doesn't mean that members are necessarily free from responsibility. So in this paper, I want to focus on what I call collective responsibility and non-agential groups. And I want to focus on a topic that I don't think has not received much attention, namely culpable ignorance in a collective setting. And my aim is to argue that culpable ignorance can be irreducibly collective, and to show what effect this has on the group's responsibility for unwitting acts and consequences. All right, so I have in mind the typical sort of idea of moral responsibility as moral blameworthiness, but a helpful distinction to keep in mind is the one between scope and degree, where scope concerns what it is that you're responsible for. So for example, you're responsible for stealing a wallet, and the degree is how much you are to blame for whatever it is that you did. Okay, let's go to a standard case of culpable ignorance. So suppose a doctor is unaware of a patient's allergy and the patient dies due to complications of the treatment. If the doctor is to be responsible for her unwitting act, so the act done out of ignorance, then she must be responsible for her benighting act, so an omission to inform herself. And suppose the doctor's ignorance of the fact that the treatment should not have been administered is her fault. For example, she misread the patient's chart. If so, then without having a legitimate excuse, the doctor is blameworthy for the patient's death. So the doctor here is derivatively blameworthy for the patient's death in virtue of being responsible for misreading the patient's chart. But if, of course, the doctor has an excuse for her ignorance, for example, a resident failed to register this information, then the doctor is not blameworthy for her unwitting act and the consequences. So we can capture this in the following principle, and maybe the derivative part is not really important here. So an agent is blameworthy for the consequences of an unwitting act only if she is blameworthy for her ignorance the act was wrong. Right, so the agent must be blameworthy for her ignorance in order to be blameworthy for the unwitting act. But when is an agent blameworthy for her ignorance? Well, we typically say something like, she should have known better, she could have known, and this is sort of like an allegation, and when it's fair, it implies that the ignorance was avoidable and typically stems from some failure of the agent. So given this, we might think of something like the following principle, which is widely accepted within the literature. An agent is blameworthy for ignorance of a moral or non-moral fact if and only if she could reasonably have been expected to take measures that would have avoided or remedied this ignorance. All right, so these two principles are, I think, relatively widely accepted within the field of culpable ignorance. And so let's see how this plays out when we look at certain collective cases. In particular, I want to focus on the following case, Outbreak. So two scientists, John and Eve, are members of a global health think tank tasked with protecting the world from diseases X, Y, Z. John studies the nature of a particular infectious disease X, and Eve's studies is related to the environmental and sociological aspects of Y and Z. John's groundbreaking research proves conclusively fact A. Virus X mutates into a highly contagious and deadly hybrid X star under very specific circumstances C. Eve's groundbreaking research proves conclusively fact B. In environment E, these very specific circumstances C are generated by the diseases Y and Z because of sociological and environmental factors. From the combined results, it can be inferred that O, an outbreak of X star in E, is imminent. In the think tank, there are norms of transparency and confidentiality, So members are expected to share relevant knowledge, but keep all shared information confidential. And although John and Eve are both fully aware of these norms and they know full well that they ought to share their research, neither shares their research on various occasions because they fear someone will steal their idea and publish the results before them. After some time, there is a disastrous outbreak of X star in E, and this is an outbreak they could have prevented. So what's going on in Outbreak? So let's look at some features that I think are important to keep in mind. So first, while John and Eve are part of an organized group, a group agent, so the think tank, John and Eve as a plurality constitute merely a non-agential group. There is no particular kind of commitment between them. There's no shared intention. There's no accepted decision-making procedure between them merely as a plurality. So while they're members of a larger group, they are a group within a group, and they don't qualify as a group agent themselves. Now, John and Eve violate what I call a moral duty of exchange. And this is a bit different than a duty of inquiry, where you need to inform yourself. But a duty of exchange is where an individual ought to share potentially relevant information in particular circumstances for the pursuit of morally weighty goals. And so the question arises, well, first, of course, who is blameworthy for their inaction? But that will, be traced back to their ignorance of O. So the question will become, who is culpable for John and Eve's ignorance of O? So let's start with individual culpability or responsibility. So the problem seems to be that John has an excuse for his ignorance of O. So John could not have avoided his ignorance of B, as Eve did not share her information that B. And therefore, as it happens, it seems that it would be unfair to expect John to have avoided his ignorance of O, because he could only infer O from facts A and B, but he only knew fact A, and he didn't know fact B because Eve did not share her information. And something similar seems, a similar excuse seems available to Eve. And so the idea is that the wrongdoing in Outbreak, so of both John and Eve, the failure to share important information, serves as an excuse for the other's ignorance of O. And so given reasonable expectation, neither John nor Eve is individually culpable for his or her ignorance of O. Now, let me go to what I think is the answer to the question before I consider two other possible options. So let's turn to collective culpability. So I think that John and Eve are responsible for their culpability or ignorance of O together. So it seems fair to allege that they should have known that O. The circumstances allowed for it that they could have obtained this knowledge had they all done what they should have been doing. And so while it seems unfair to expect John or Eve individually to have avoided their ignorance of O, it is fair to expect John and Eve together to have known that an outbreak of X star was imminent, because they could easily have taken measures sufficient for avoiding their ignorance. And so I think that John and Eve's culpability for their ignorance of O is irreducibly collective. It is non-distributive. It is something that applies to them both, but not individually. All right, now some might want to resist this conclusion, and they might want to find different ways of explaining, or explaining away at least the responsibility here, perhaps, or find a different way to account for it. So let's look at two other options that I think might be might seem plausible, at least at the start. So could there be no culpability for the ignorance of O? So what if we say that John and Eve are individually culpable for violating their respective duties of exchange, but nothing more? One might think that this has a potential advantage of avoiding the postulation of a particular kind of epistemic collective obligation of a non-agential group, right? So if we say that John and Eve are collectively responsible for their ignorance of O, perhaps we think that, well, because the sort of the blame for their ignorance implies that there was some kind of fault and that there was some kind of violation of a sort of epistemic procedural obligation. And given that the blame was collective, maybe this obligation should also be collective. And this seems to violate some basic principles, although there's a very big debate about the obligations of non-agential groups. But some might think that this is incoherent and therefore it's an objection. Now, of course, I also think that proponents of collective obligations might take this case to be something that comes in their favor. Let me briefly respond to this. So first, in terms of the analysis of responsibility, I think this distributive analysis leaves a gap between what intuitively John and Eve are blameworthy for and the individual responsibility we would attribute in this case. So it does seem that John and Eve are culpable for their ignorance of O, especially when we turn to the consequences and think what this means. Right, so it meant like their ignorance of O is the main reason why they were not preventing this outbreak. So I'll come back to this in the end. But to say something about the collective obligation, as I've also argued elsewhere, I think that collective responsibility of a non-agential group does not necessarily entail the violation of a collective obligation. So if we're conservative about, to what kind of entities do we attribute obligations, we can simply say, well, no, in this case, collective responsibility does not mean that the group had violated a collective obligation. We might simply say the group violated 2 individual duties which resulted in wrongdoing, but to properly account for this wrongdoing and the blame that comes with it, we need to blame the group rather than any of the individuals. So I don't think that this is a good answer to Outbreak. Another possible answer would be to argue that it is John who is responsible for the ignorance of Eve of O, and Eve is responsible for the ignorance of John of O. So we might think that there is some kind of interpersonal responsibility here. And this is not, I think, a very initially bad idea. I think it makes sense that there is some kind of interpersonal responsibility. For example, Sandy Goldberg has argued that there can be a gap between what an agent should have known and for what ignorance an agent is culpable. For example, a rookie high school baseball player may be ignorant of the fact that a hit ball is still in play if it hits the third base bag. And the backup player should have known this. There is a kind of practice-generated expectation of such knowledge. Any baseball player should know the rules of baseball. But the rookie's ignorance arguably does not stem from a fault on his part. He could not reasonably be expected to have avoided his ignorance, says Goldberg, but it's his coach who should have taught him this rule. So the rookie is not culpable for his ignorance that ultimately results in the opposite team winning the game, but it's the coach who is to blame. And so this leads to what we might think of a principle of the following sort: interpersonal reasonable expectation. So X is blameworthy for Y's ignorance of P if and only if X could reasonably have been expected to take measures that would have avoided or remedied Y's ignorance of P. So I think this principle makes sense as formulated, but I don't think it fully accounts for Outbreak, because there is an important difference. So the coach could have taken measures that were sufficient for remedying the player's ignorance. Right, so they could have told him about the rule. But in Outbreak, there's nothing that John could have done that would have been sufficient for remedying Eve's ignorance. Right, so John, of course, could have informed Eve about E, but this does not yet guarantee that Eve knows that O, right? So you need to infer O from the facts A and B, and Eve might nonetheless fail to make that inference. And I don't think that this is trivial. So the problem is that in Outbreak, each agent could only fairly have been expected to take measures that were necessary for avoiding the other's ignorance of O. And so to account for this, interpersonal reasonable expectation must then concern measures that are sufficient or necessary for avoiding Y's ignorance. But so formulated, I don't think this principle is plausible. So suppose a secretary forgets to schedule a lab for a scientist without a legitimate excuse. All labs are booked for the next semester, and access to the lab is necessary for the scientist to do her research. And suppose the research is on the brink, the scientist is on the brink of finding a cure for some disease. So the question is, so is the secretary now on the hook for the scientist's ignorance of the cure? And I think this is very counterintuitive, because the relation between the scientist's ignorance and the secretary's failure is not clear or robust enough to warrant such an ascription. And so it's reasonable in this case to expect the secretary to have taken measures necessary for avoiding the scientist's ignorance, but it's counterintuitive to think that this is sufficient for the secretary to be blameworthy for the scientist's ignorance. So the necessary version of interpersonal reasonable expectation, I think, is not plausible. And moreover, we could formulate or redesign Outbreak such that John is not the only scientist who knows that A, and if so, then John's contribution is neither necessary nor sufficient for avoiding Eve's ignorance of O. So interpersonal reasonable expectation in that case would have to include measures that merely contribute to avoiding Y's ignorance. And I think this principle would be very, very implausible. So because of this, I think that the only answer to Outbreak is that John and Eve are responsible together for their ignorance of O. Now, what does this mean for their inaction? So first, again, we might want to say, well, they're somehow individually responsible for everything that happened. But there's a problem there, because it seems that they can't be individually blameworthy for failing to prevent an outbreak, because each individual has a legitimate excuse. So if John could, reasonably speaking, not have avoided his ignorance of O, then he could, reasonably speaking, not have avoided his inaction. So again, given derivative blameworthiness, we need to say that in order for John to be responsible for his inaction or the consequences of his inaction, John needs to be blameworthy for his ignorance, but John isn't, because he has a good excuse for it. Or at least that's what the argument was earlier. So at least it seems that they both, again, have an individual excuse for their inaction. But what about the group agent? So some might say, John and Eve are part of this think tank. Why would we not say that the think tank is responsible rather than John and Eve? Well, it seems that the think tank was organized in the right way. There were norms of transparency, there were norms of confidentiality. The group did everything it could to prevent these kinds of situations, but it just seemed that two members were performing poorly in their tasks as members. And so I think this is rather a case where, just as an individual can sometimes be culpable for what they do within their functioning as a group member, sometimes a group can be culpable for their doing within a group agent for their functioning as group members. So to support this, normally if the consequences of an unwitting act are foreseeable to a reasonable degree, and one is culpable for one's ignorance about the unwitting act, then we typically think that one is blameworthy to some degree for the consequences. And so I think the fact that John and Eve are collectively responsible for their ignorance of O here is crucial, because it removes any excuse for their inaction. Right, so they are culpable for their ignorance of O, and because of this, we can also say that they're culpable for their inaction, which ultimately led to, say, the deaths of hundreds of people because of the outbreak of X star. So the conclusion is that John and Eve are collectively responsible, so in a non-distributive way, for failing to prevent a deadly outbreak of X star. Okay, to conclude, so it's interesting, I think, to see that what makes the culpability for John and Eve's ignorance irreducibly collective is that each agent's violation of a duty of exchange provides the other member individually with an excuse for their ignorance of some further morally relevant fact, right? So there will always be this kind of idea that they're ignorant of this further morally relevant fact that could have been inferred from them sharing the information within the group context, or perhaps they should have even had certain duties of inquiry and they failed to violate them. And from those things that they could have known, it would have been further inferred that some further morally relevant fact would have been salient for particular actions that are morally pressing. Now, whether it's fair to expect individuals to have avoided their ignorance or the group to have avoided their ignorance will depend on the circumstances. But I think it's good to see that this pattern can show up within any group. It need not be within a group agent, as long as there's some kind of salience of sharing information or finding relevant information out, then I think this kind of pattern can show up. So to conclude, I think that irreducibly collective culpable ignorance potentially creates numerous cases where non-agential groups are blameworthy as such for unwitting acts or consequences. Thank you.